So King's speech was the culmination of the March on Washington, which was meant to put pressure on the federal government to pass legislation that would force Southern governments to comply with court orders to desegregate public facilities and to register black voters in the South. Ultimately, this would be the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965, which were an echo of the Civil Rights Acts of the Radical Republicans, which had been passed nearly a century earlier. So one interesting aspect of King's speech was the degree to which it was self-consciously historical. Okay, so he's alluding to the Emancipation Proclamation, he's alluding to the end of slavery, and he's rooting the cause of the civil rights movement in an emancipationist understanding of what the Civil War was really about. Okay, so starting with the choice of location, so you notice in the background they've got that statue of Abraham Lincoln. It's the memorial to Lincoln, and Lincoln, of course, is the great emancipator. So the message is unmistakable that the civil rights movement is the ultimate fruit of what had happened under the Civil War, meaning it's meant to be an end to slavery. It's supposed to be a moment in which freedom is promised, and he's trying to make the United States make good on that promise of freedom. Now, King's emancipationist understanding of the war was counterpoised, on the other hand, with a reassertion of lost cause mythology by Southern whites in the 1950s and the 1960s. So as Southern states such as Virginia resisted desegregation efforts, so they tried to prevent the desegregation of schools, the integration of public facilities, so these states wrapped themselves in the Confederate flag in order to defend their point of view. So Southern segregationists claimed that they were the freedom fighters, that they were trying to defend their homeland against a tyrannical government that was trying to undercut states' rights and to impose a centralized Yankee-style government. And so some states, like Georgia, even rejigged their state flag, and they actually placed the stars and bars front and center in 1956. So before that, they actually hadn't had the Confederate flag on their own flag. After 1956, they place the rebel flag into their own flag to underline their commitment to the cause of segregation and white supremacy. And South Carolina actually starts flying the stars and bars on their state legislature in the 1950s, again for the same reason. And so for states such as Georgia or Virginia, opposition to desegregation orders was in keeping with a quote-unquote heritage of resisting impositions of federal authority, both under Lincoln and during the period of radical Reconstruction. This point of view was deeply entrenched in the culture of the region. For several generations, citizens groups such as the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy were sort of this group of respectable Southern white ladies who saw their Confederate heritage as an integral part of who they were. They sort of saw their role as keeping the flame of family memory alive, and so one of the ways in which they did this is through celebrating the cause of the Confederacy. And one of the ways in which they did this was by insisting upon a version of history that was rooted in the ideology of the lost cause. So one of the leading lights in this respect was Mildred Rutherford, who was the house historian of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the early 20th century, so commonly known as Miss Millie. Here she is, dressed in a kind of plantation uniforms, or this sort of outfit she might wear if she were going to a cotillion. And she had waged a long campaign, a national campaign, so it's not just in the South, but it's sort of national for the entire United States, to insist that no textbooks published by national companies should present a version of American history that was disparaging to the memory of Confederate leaders or of Confederate soldiers. And so, sort of a first principle of this cause was that the war was not about slavery. That the South was not besmirched by this kind of tainted memory, but no, the South was fighting for a noble cause. And any textbook that insinuated otherwise was an insult to Southern honor. And so from this point of view, the position of Southern segregationists, in their view, was common sense. It was upholding a noble set of values, just as their ancestors had done a century before. And so this helps to explain what was going on with the events of 2015 and 2017. So on one hand, you have some groups that are espousing a white supremacist version of what the Civil War was about. So you have Dylan Roof, who's framing these questions in racist terms. You have the neo-Nazis who went to Charlottesville, who also understand a kind of racial hierarchy behind what happened in the Civil War. But then you also have a kind of ambiguity, okay? Because wrapped together with this white supremacist understanding of the war is also a reconciliationist understanding that this is a matter of national unity. It's not necessarily about slavery or racism. That in fact, it's about coming together under common symbols. And that's where you get statements like Donald Trump saying that there are good people on both sides. That there's, essentially this is a matter of reconciliation rather than trying to understand the war as a watershed moment in terms of American political principles. And then on the other hand, you have an understanding of the war in emancipationist terms. Okay, so from this point of view, the Southern symbols, the Confederate symbols that are invoked by Dylan Roof and the Unite the Right figures in Charlottesville are a provocation. They're essentially a statement of white supremacist values, and the Confederacy is an unmistakable symbol of those values. So if you want to tackle racism, if you actually want to combat or confront America's history of racism, as well as racism in the present, you have to dispense with, once and for all, the false mythology of the lost cause and to eliminate all vestiges of the Confederacy that celebrate what ultimately was a war fought in defense of slavery. So the struggle to remove Confederate statues is not merely an academic question of which version of the past is actually true. It's also a political struggle over who has power in society, who gets a chance to speak when it comes to telling stories about history. And while it seems that the tide seems to be turning against Confederate monuments, we would be well advised to listen to the words of the Southern novelist William Faulkner. The past is never dead. It's not even past.